Thank you so much for joining us on Fiscal Matters, a podcast of the Financial and Fiscal Commission. Today we are joined by the Honorable Mmusi Maimane, who is the chairperson of the Standing Committee on Appropriations in Parliament. Welcome, Honorable Member.
Thank you so much, and it's great to be here at the FFC, and I think it's a privilege to be able to be here at this time, at such a time as this in our nation, and congratulations for the role the FFC plays, and I think this is an opportunity for us to shape what tomorrow looks like.
Thank you so much. As the new chairperson of the Standing Committee on Appropriations under the new government of national unity, what is your vision for the committee and what are your priorities as you implement your new mandate?
Firstly, I think it's important to understand where the committee is located in law. And in terms of the Money Bills Act, it gives us incredible powers as our interaction with the budget that is tabled in our nation. So what I would like to achieve is that in the 5-year period, if we were to look back and say, what did this 7th administration for this particular committee look like, is that it must give effect to the full implementation of the law. It must be able to interact with the budget, not in a compliance rubber stamp mechanism, but really to be able to say, given the powers to amend, to reject, is it able to do that? But not in an oppositional manner, in a genuinely constructive nation-building manner. So I'd like to always think of ourselves, we've got to shift away, secondly, from probity to performance. Because I think historically, committees of parliament look at infringements, corruption, etc. But we don't often assess performance. Are we able to look back and say, if we appropriate 100 rands to security, are we getting full value through the policing, etc., etc.? When we whatever the appropriation is, are we able to do that? That's the second thing. The third thing is, I want us to be quite deliberate about emanating from the laws, emanating from performance. Are we efficient? Because part of the dilemma that we face is that the processing of legislation is often hurried, it is not consultative. So I want us to look back at that period and say, have we been able to make the appropriate adjustments so that actually where the people are represented, which is not in the executive, it is only in parliament, they're given full effect. The last two things that I think we're going to prioritize as a committee is you can't fix everything in the 5-year period. So let's pick some key strategic areas. And our obsession is, where are the instruments that we use to fund for growth? And that speaks to the issue of infrastructure, that speaks to how we look at state-owned enterprises, that speaks to how we look at broadly, when I talked about that performance dynamic, we cannot as a legacy say we presided over a budget that achieved a 1% GDP growth for the next 5 years, as it has been for the last 10 years. Because in net effect, it means South Africans are getting poorer progressively. And then ultimately, as part of the legacy areas, is that I've wanted to say to myself, part of the legacy I want to leave behind is the capacity of the appropriations and the finance cluster in total, whether in partnership with the FFC, the PBO, and all our stakeholder relations and public consultation, that those be strengthened and be meaningful. Because at least in my immediate interaction, some of what I sense, and part of the legacy issues, is that even when you talk about public consultation, you are asking citizens to arrive and say, make submissions, you note them, but it's not material. The PBO makes recommendations, you note them, but they are not material, because we've inherited a legacy of majoritarianism, where you just simply say, well, it doesn't matter what the input is, the government will just vote it through. Whereas now I think it's an ideal time to say, as the FFC in the Constitution, let's understand that, let's begin to work with it so that actually it gives effect to what we do. So those partnerships are important. So I would hope that when we write the legacy report at the end of the administration, we can say we're able to amend the budget, we're able to move departments to performance so that accountability is better effected, and ultimately ensure that we've got better capacity and get a better partnership with stakeholders.
You spoke about state-owned entities. We know that they've been struggling quite a lot. For instance, Transnet, which is critical in terms of our infrastructure. What are your thoughts in terms of state-owned entities reform? Do you have any plans in terms of going forward, in terms of allocations towards these entities?
I think part of it is historically we haven't been able to do a thorough deep dive into each one and its own performance and treat it on its merit. I'm not dogmatic about privatize or keep them in the public fiscus. That's the realm of politics. That's where people must debate. But at least at a basic level, we've been asking the question about their own governance framework. So one of the things that I've tasked the Public Service Commission is to be able to give us a framework as to when you appoint a board for an SOE, it must look like this. There's no use me sending people to the water board who've never worked with water engineering in all of their lives. It just doesn't help. So the governance issue. The second issue is that on its finance, we don't have an oversight portfolio framework at the moment. So we've asked for the role to be able to give oversight to the financial allocations that go into SOEs, because what we cannot do is look back and say all we've done is ended up with more bailouts and more bailouts. I'm not convinced that the idea of having a holding company is the best way forward. I know the president is having that conversation. I'd like to engage him further on that to see how they work from a governance frame, whether to create a holdco is going to actually achieve the results that we need. But furthermore is to be able to say when we look at the appropriations, and I've asked for a few of them, particularly taking on Transnet, does it have the best leadership? Does it have the best governance framework? And are we including economic efficiencies that go into that? And how do we benchmark ourselves globally? Because when you look at a port, take Singapore, take any other country, you can see the efficiencies are built into it. In South Africa, we're still lagging behind in that. So if we are going to invest in these SOEs as a shareholder, I'd like to put it, then I think we need to be able to put some performance criteria that says it's not just conditions for loans that convert debt to equity, but it's ultimately about saying, here are the performance criteria we'd like to see. It cannot be that I was in KZN over the weekend and you end up with a whole backlog of vessels that cannot dock, that cannot offload goods. Those inefficiencies mean that it's immaterial how much appropriations you make or how much the bigger the budget pool is. If it's inefficient, you are going to end up with just throwing money down a block hole. So I would like us to really interrogate them in that sense.
In terms of value for money, Maimane, government really needs to get value for money in terms of its spending. So if you look at the priorities of government and how we have spent so much money, for instance, on education, are we getting value for money on education as a country? If you have to look at how many billions of rands over the years have been spent on our basic education.
Not at all. And I think, the indicators speak for themselves. So, for example, when at a primary school level you end up with 8 out of 10 of our children not being able to read for meaning, when you look at the fact that for every 100, if the 100 children start school, only 60 of them will end up in matric, with 40 of them having dropped out. And of those 60, 14 will only be able to qualify for university over the cumulative period. And then also the pass mark is that 40 of those same children are not able to qualify for university entrance. It's quite clear that we're building a society that from a skills pipeline point of view delivers the current scenario of over 10 million children not being necessary, or 10 million youth not being in education that needs. They're not in education, they're not in employment, they're not in training. So that picture tells me that there's a mismatch between economic demand and educational outputs. So it's got to be important that we look at that as an indicator and say, in this instance, budget isn't the issue. The capture in certain instances by unions is a fundamental challenge. In other instances, the lack of performance management by teachers. In other latrines, and all of that, or children are not able to gain access to a school because the bridge that was meant to be built, so children are not getting there. So I think we need to review the ecosystem of education. But education is but one example. I'm looking at healthcare as an example, as another example. Here we sit cumulatively with a 77 billion rand medical legal claim. You've got to answer the question, how many doctors those are, how many nurses those could have been, how many more hospitals we could have built. So even where you've got health budgets being deployed, you still end up with a lot of wastage and leakage. And so our committee can't just, in partnership with the Auditor General and multiple stakeholders, can't just be arriving to say we're going to look at compliance and probity, because it's become quite the norm that that's all you look into. We've got to be able to say, is it bang for buck? Is it bang for buck in security, in education, in healthcare? So that when we look at the total budget and look at the 60% social wage spend, we've got to say to ourselves, is it reaching its fullest potential? Or is it, in essence, being caught up in backlogs that we are inefficient as a government in being able to fully utilize the resources that are put before the people?
Absolutely. No, thank you so much. I think under your leadership, we are quite confident that you're going to guide us as a country. Do you think the priorities of our budget process that you are implementing are still relevant under the government of national unity, or are we on the right track?
I think, if you look at the stated objectives, and I reflected this back to the presidency, no one can disagree that we need to keep the lights on. We need, efficiencies around Transnet. We need to keep citizens safe and educated. No one can disagree with those priorities. The difficulty is that, firstly, if everything is a priority, then nothing is. So I think the only question South Africa must ask itself is, does this activity budget allocation deliver the necessary growth? That must be a priority. That must be the overarching, it's got to be, as the president puts it, inclusive growth. We've got to frame everything around that question. And then second to that, I think part of the dilemma that the state faces is that we've lost capacity to execute. So I find often that even in aspects of procurement, I just was meeting with the procurement office as deployed by Treasury. You realize that not only do we procure the wrong things at times or overpay for them, but our capacity to spend is poor. The National Student Financial Aid Scheme is a prime example in a country where young people are not being able to get free higher education over a long period of time. Here they sit, and money is being sent back to Treasury in the hundreds of millions. Now that essentially is an indicator of the fact that regardless of the demand, the state's capability to be able to deploy resources is poor. So my urgent cry is that if the fifth and sixth administration were about a faltering of two things: one, state capture, and two, the weakening of state institution, the seventh administration must be about the rebuilding of state capacity and institutional, so that we are not at the whim of whoever the leader is. It must be the institutional capacity to be able to deliver for itself. But then furthermore, we've got to see the rise of Parliament. I think Parliament symbolically may be burnt down in the last administration. And I think that's a symbol of the state of accountability and how we lost it. Now we have the hard duty of rebuilding it, not only physically, but also in its capacity. We need to be able to say, where the people speak in Parliament, are those interests being expressed and the executive be held accountable? That we really say the goals, as you express them, are not just the goals of the executive or whatever the party is, that emanating from the Constitution, these are our shared goals. And these are what we can do. Because when you achieve that, there are certain things that the state, just in a 2.1 trillion rand budget, cannot be able to achieve on its own. It's entirely up to whether the private sector comes on board and says, we are going to drive employment because that is part of the objective that we've got to reach. And so the state becomes a partner. So that when we do procurement, when you use that 2.1 trillion rands to say we want linen for a hospital, that there be a business there that is able to deliver quality linen so that we're not importing the things we can make locally. So it's that type of partnership and a national objective that has to be shared across not only the state but the private sector and citizens at large, because we're not going to ever have enough police for everybody. We can't police every individual, but when we have shared values, shared objectives, I always think when a guest is coming to our house, even the children line up and say, hey, we must clean our rooms, we must do this, because all of us are working in unison for the guest. Now, as a country, we've got to say to ourselves, if the growth organizer, then everybody needs to be able to say, for the purposes of growth, here's what we are all going to do. And the state must use its own purchasing power, as the private sector must use its own innovation, etc., so that collectively we're able to say, when we look at South Africa 10, 15 years from now, we could say, the first 30 years were about us establishing democratic practice. The next 30 years must be about us really talking about a society that is flourishing and prospering. Those things must be the focal points.
Absolutely. I think there you have it. So we need a state that is able to deliver, working along with business as well as civil society. And thank you so much, Honorable Maimane, for this contribution. I think it's going to give us food for thought.
No. And I'm looking forward to working with the FFC in that partnership, and so that we really, as South Africans, grapple with what we need to do, rather than just simply say, we've always done it like this. Even though our laws give us so much capacity, we just have never tested. It's a bit like I always say, our constitution and our laws are like the Rolls Royce, but we've never gotten out of first gear.
Absolutely. Hopefully we're going to get into the Rolls Royce now. Thank you so much.